President Trump says he won't bend on border wall funding on day 16 of a partial government shutdown. The president traveled to Camp David earlier for a White House retreat where immigration policy is at the top of the agenda. Before he left, Mr. Trump told reporters a spending deal could be within striking distance, but he blamed Democrats for stalled negotiations.
Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and myself can solve this in 20 minutes if they want to. If they don't want to, it's going to go on for a long time. I will tell you this, if we don't find a solution, it's going to go on for a long time. There's not going to be any bend right here.
This comes as Vice President Mike Pence leads talks with congressional leaders this weekend. After nearly 2 hours of talks Saturday, the White House says no progress was made. The spending fight was also the focus of the Sunday morning shows. Here's some of what you may have missed.
This is the first president in history who shut down his own government. Unfortunately, there are going to be people to suffer. Look at those at the airport who are carefully going through the passengers to make sure that they're safe on airplanes. As of next Friday, they'll miss a payday. That may mean some problems for mortgage payments, problems in balancing the budget of their own families and households. This is totally unnecessary.
The fences that we have built on the southern border, the ones that were already there under Republican leadership, Democrat leadership, they're in San Diego, they're in El Paso, more than 90% effective in preventing criminal immigration. We need more of that. Do we need it from coast to coast, 2,000 miles all the way across? No, and the president has admitted as such. There are places in the middle of nowhere where technology will be better. But a barrier, call it a wall, call it a fence. The president actually said he didn't care what you call it. He even offered to let the Democrats help him design something. He says as long as it's effective, he doesn't care what you call it. We need something to prevent people from coming into this country illegally.
The president spends most of his time talking about how we're not spending enough on national security. Now he wants to take $20 billion out of the defense budget to build a wall, which, by the way, is not going to improve our border security. The president seems unaware of this, but we've actually already built a wall across much of the border.
But it would be outrageous for Democrats who agree with the president. That's what's the most outrageous thing to me, and something that, frankly, is so just incomprehensible. They agree with the president. They agree that we need border security. They just are unwilling to let this president win. And I think at some point they have to decide that they care more about Americans than fighting the president. And so far we haven't seen a willingness on their side to fully do that.
Let's bring in Mark Landler. He's a White House correspondent for the New York Times. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. Let's start with the shutdown. We heard the president say that this could be solved in, quote, 20 minutes. Congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle are meeting Sunday with Vice President Mike Pence. At this point, is there a realistic deal that could satisfy both sides?
At this point, Elaine, there's not at all. They're miles away, and you know, the fact that this negotiation is being carried out by Vice President Mike Pence to some extent is all you really need to know. Any deal would have to involve President Trump himself, probably meeting with Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer directly. What you have instead this weekend is a series of very large meetings involving the Vice President, Jared Kushner, Mick Mulvaney, and not the principals from the Hill, but their aides. And that kind of a format is just not going to yield a breakthrough. But I'm frankly not sure a breakthrough is what anyone thinks is in the cards. No one has shown, as the president said himself in those remarks, any sign of give in their position. There's frankly no reason for them to, with the Democrats having just reclaimed the House, with President Trump recognizing that this is a terrific campaign issue for him and playing to his base. There's really no motivation on either side to reach any kind of an accommodation right now, and I don't think there will be any motive until the shutdown really begins to bite, until some of the interruption in services, the TSA lines at airports, garbage not being picked up, income tax refunds being delayed. Until that stuff really starts to bite, I don't think you're going to really see pressure to come to any kind of an accommodation. I think we're looking at several more days of this at the minimum.
Yeah, not at all with the federal workers, the hundreds of thousands of them who are furloughed or working without pay, not at all what they want to hear right now. But the president also reiterated Sunday that he is considering declaring a state of emergency. This would mean that he would bypass Congress to secure funds for his border wall. Mark, is that a realistic option?
Well, Whether it's realistic or not doesn't necessarily mean that he won't try to do it. But as a legal matter, it's highly questionable. It would almost certainly be challenged in the courts. Congress would regard it as executive overreach. So he might well do it, and then he might find himself tied up in court, as he has with elements of his travel ban and other things he's done on immigration. But as you've seen, it's such a core issue. It's so resonant with his political base that I don't think the potential of a legal challenge is going to stop him.
So funding is the first fight of this new Congress. How is this impacting the White House's relationship with leaders on both sides of the aisle?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing that I've sort of noticed in the early days of this shutdown battle is how little we've seen from the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. He's really removed himself from the debate almost entirely. Mitch McConnell has always been one of the key people who have been involved in cutting deals to reopen the government in the past. He's not been a big player on this particular shutdown. The other obvious thing is, I think the president is feeling the loss of his total command of the airwaves that he's had really for the first 2 years of his presidency. You know, this week you saw him having to share the spotlight with Nancy Pelosi when she was sworn in as House Speaker, with Elizabeth Warren as she made her first trip out to Iowa for her exploratory presidential bid. And I think you're seeing a frustration on the part of the president. I think you saw it when he came out to the briefing room a few days ago with those Customs and Border Patrol officers. I think you saw it the next day in the Rose Garden when he gave that incredibly long, discursive, wide-ranging news conference. This is a guy who's used to dominating attention, soaking up all the airtime, and for the first time in this era of divided government, he's having to compete with others. And I think that was an interesting thing to watch this past week.
Just quickly on Mitch McConnell, why do you think we haven't seen him? Does he just not want to have any kind of ownership of this shutdown and kind of not be another Republican face?
I don't think he sees an easy fix here, and I'm not sure he sees the political motivation for him, for his Senate Republican caucus, to get heavily involved in this. He really views this as a battle between the president, who's not willing to bend, and the Democrats, who are newly empowered and hence not willing to bend. I think he may also be concerned about some restiveness in his own ranks. There are a number of Republican senators who are facing re-election in 2020 for whom this is a somewhat dangerous issue. Cory Gardner, Susan Collins in Maine, and I think he's a little bit worried about trying to keep control of his own caucus, and so probably keeping a low profile might be one way to try to do that.
All right, well, from one negotiation to another, the U.S. and China are due to meet Monday in Beijing for trade talks. What can we expect there?
Well, I mean, the president, again, has staked out a very strong position, very tough position. But on both sides of the Pacific, there is growing economic pressure to try to stem this trade war. In China, you see some real evidence of economic slowdown. The president's not wrong when he says China's in some economic trouble. On the U.S. side, you see a great deal of turbulence in the market. And I think that will increase the pressure on the American negotiators to try to arrive at some kind of settlement. The trick here is the issues that the U.S. is pressing China on are really very deeply rooted in their economy. They'd require fairly radical steps, and China has not shown any inclination in the past to take those kinds of steps. So we'd really have to see a shift in mindset on the Chinese side. I'm not sure that these coming talks at the level they're being conducted are likely to produce that kind of breakthrough. I think that kind of breakthrough probably depends on another meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader. But I think, you know, there will be a greater degree of urgency on both sides to try to get the ball rolling with this week's talks.
Switching gears, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's federal grand jury was extended for 6 months Saturday. How should we understand that, Mark?
I think that probably the best way to understand it is that the judge has decided that Robert Mueller is unearthing details that are worthy of keeping a grand jury impaneled. It's probably an indication that there are really substantive things that are being kind of unearthed by the special counsel. Now, we don't know. The special counsel has been tremendously good at keeping a lid on his operation, and so to some extent we're only guessing. But you look for these sort of external signs that that the investigation is really substantive and making progress. And when you see a grand jury get extended beyond its normal lifespan, that is one interesting indicator.
So we're barely into this new year, but let's talk 2020 and looking ahead. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren has officially launched her presidential bid. She's faced scrutiny over her decision to use a DNA test to prove Native American ancestry. Let's listen to what she said in Iowa Saturday.
I am not a person of color. I am not a citizen of a tribe. Tribal citizenship is very different from ancestry. Tribes and only tribes determine tribal citizenship, and I respect that difference.
So what does it say that this was sort of the first issues, or one of the first issues that Warren discussed on the campaign trail in response to a question?
Well, I'm sure that from Elizabeth Warren's perspective, she'd like to take up this issue and dispose of it as quickly as possible. I think the problem she's going to face is that people like President Trump and her own Democratic opponents may not be willing to let it die so quickly. I mean, look, the way she handled the DNA testing is widely acknowledged to have been a political fumble on her part. Re-injecting this issue into her nascent presidential campaign in such a big way, and President Trump and others jumped on it. That said, she attracted very big crowds in Iowa. People came from long distances to hear her, and that was, you know, a good portent for her in terms of the interest her candidacy is going to generate. She's clearly going to be a top-tier candidate. But, you know, the fact that she had to address this issue the way she did early on and get into this rather complicated discussion of tribal jurisdiction and tribal custom just goes to show how this is likely to be something that will dog her as the weeks and months tick on.
Right, a lot to watch here in the year ahead. Mark Landler, thank you so much. Great to have your insight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Elaine.